My son was sitting on the front steps of his own house when I pulled up. He had our granddaughter on his lap and 2 suitcases beside him. He didn't see me at first. He was staring at the ground, the way men stare when they're trying not to fall apart in front of their children. I sat in the truck for a moment before I got out. I had known this day was coming for 14 months. I had planned for it, prepared for it, and still, seeing my son on those steps with little Grace asleep against his chest, it hit me somewhere deep that no amount of planning can reach. I got out of the truck. He looked up. "Dad." His voice broke on that one word. "Get in the truck," I said. "Both of you." He looked at me like he wanted to ask 100 questions. I just opened the back door and held out my arms for Grace. She stirred, blinked at me with those heavy eyes, and went right back to sleep on my shoulder like she'd done since she was an infant. My son picked up the suitcases. I stopped him. "Leave them." "Dad, those are—" I said, "Leave them. You won't need anything from this house. Not anymore." He stared at me. Then he set them down and walked to the truck. He had no idea that I had been waiting for this exact moment, and he had no idea what was about to happen to the man who thought he could throw my family away like garbage. My name is Raymond Holt. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, built a quiet life in western Pennsylvania, raised one son after my wife Carol passed from cancer when our boy was 11. I'm not a man who makes noise. I'm not a man who threatens. I'm a man who builds things carefully and makes sure they don't fall down. My son's name is Thomas. He's 36. Smart, decent, the kind of man who still holds doors open for strangers and means it. He works as a high school history teacher, which tells you everything you need to know about what he values. He didn't marry for money. He married because he fell in love with a woman named Serena Whitfield, and he believed she loved him back. Serena's father is Victor Whitfield. If you live anywhere near Allegheny County, you know that name. Victor Whitfield owns 14 commercial properties, 2 car dealerships, and enough local politicians to fill a small banquet hall. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and waits for people to come to him. He never learned how to be uncomfortable, and that made him dangerous in ways most people don't recognize until it's too late. I recognized it the first time I met him. Thomas brought Serena home for Thanksgiving 3 years ago. She was lovely, warm smile, easy laugh, the kind of woman who genuinely asks follow-up questions when you tell her something about yourself. I liked her. I still like her, if I'm honest. She is not the villain of this story, though she made choices that cost my son more than she understands. Victor came with her that year. He sat at my kitchen table and looked around my house the way a building inspector looks at a structure he already knows he's going to condemn. He didn't say anything rude. He didn't have to. The slight pause before he complimented my home said everything. "Nice place, Raymond. Real. Cozy. Cozy." Like it was a word he'd had to reach for. I handed him a beer and said thank you, and watched him for the rest of that evening. By the time he left, I had formed a complete picture of Victor Whitfield. The picture wasn't flattering. Thomas and Serena got engaged 6 months later. I was happy for them. I was also cautious, which I kept to myself because a man's happiness deserves a fair chance before you introduce doubt into it. The wedding was at Victor's estate in Fox Chapel. 240 guests. An open bar that never ran dry. Victor gave a toast that was really a speech about himself, how he'd raised a daughter with high standards, how he hoped Thomas understood the responsibility that came with marrying into a family like the Whitfields. He said it warmly with a smile, and everyone laughed in the right places. Thomas laughed too. I did not. I drove home that night thinking about the word responsibility, about the way Victor had used it, about the slight emphasis on a family like the Whitfields, as if he were extending a conditional invitation that could be revoked. I filed that away and said nothing. Grace was born 14 months into the marriage. She came into the world at 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and her father's chin. Thomas called me from the hospital at 2 in the morning, and his voice was different from any voice I had ever heard from him. Wide open, undone, completely new. "Dad, she's here. She's perfect." "I can't, Dad. She's just perfect." I drove to the hospital in the dark and sat beside that little girl in the nursery window for a long time. Grace changed something in Thomas. He had always been a good man, But fatherhood settled into him like ballast into a ship. He became more stable, more certain of what mattered and what didn't. He coached her t-ball team before she was old enough to play in one. He read to her every night. He was the kind of father every child deserves and not enough children get. He was her father in every way that counts. I want to be very clear about that. The complications started, as they often do, not all at once, but in small pieces that seem unrelated until you lay them out side by side. Thomas mentioned, about 8 months after Grace was born, that Victor had offered him a position at Whitfield Properties. Not a construction or development role. Victor wanted Thomas to interface with community stakeholders, which is a polished way of saying he wanted a well-liked teacher with no business experience to be a friendly face for projects that needed one. He wants me to leave teaching? I asked. He says the money would be, Dad, it's 3 times what I make now. What does Serena think? Thomas paused. She thinks I should take it. I asked him what he thought. He said he was considering it. I told him to take his time. I didn't say anything else. He took the job 2 months later. I visited his new office on the 3rd floor of Victor's flagship building downtown. Nice view. Nice desk. A lot of leather and mahogany that felt borrowed rather than earned. Thomas wore a new suit that didn't quite look like him yet. He was proud. I was proud of him for being proud and worried about what he'd had to leave behind to get there. Things moved quickly after that. Victor began including Thomas in meetings that seemed designed to make him feel necessary. Dinners at the Whitfield house became more frequent. Grace, who was walking and talking by then, and had opinions about everything, became a fixture at those dinners. Victor doted on her in the performed way of men who know they're being watched. But I started noticing things, small things at first. The way Victor looked at Thomas, sometimes not with contempt exactly, but with a kind of tolerant amusement. The way Serena occasionally finished Victor's sentences when the topic turned to family finances. The way certain conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. I started paying closer attention. It was my neighbor Dale who first pointed me in a direction I hadn't considered. Dale has worked in family law for 28 years. He's not my attorney, he's my neighbor, and we've shared a fence line and a lot of Saturday mornings since 1997. One evening we were sitting on my back porch and I was telling him generally about the situation with Thomas and Victor, not accusing anyone of anything, just thinking out loud. Dale was quiet for a while. You said Victor offered Thomas the job, but did he ever actually give him a formal contract? I didn't know. I called Thomas that night and asked, casually, as if I was just curious about the HR details. There was no formal employment contract. Thomas was on a month-to-month arrangement, classified as an independent contractor, which Victor had explained as being more flexible for both parties. Dale looked at me over his coffee the next morning. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I started making notes. I began keeping a journal, nothing dramatic, just dates and observations. What was said at dinners, what Thomas mentioned about his work, the particular way Victor phrased things when the subject of Grace's future came up. Victor liked to talk about Grace's future. He used words like our legacy and the Whitfield name in ways that made my jaw tight. About 5 months into keeping that journal, Serena came to visit me alone. This was unusual. I made her coffee, and we sat in the kitchen, and she was quiet for a long time before she said anything. Raymond, I want you to know that I love Thomas. I know you do, I said, and I love Grace more than anything in the world. I know that too. She looked at her cup. My father has ideas about how things should be, about what Grace's life should look like. And sometimes those ideas and Thomas's ideas aren't the same. What kind of ideas? She looked up. There was something in her eyes that I can only describe as a woman standing at a fork in a road she hadn't chosen and wasn't sure she could change. He wants Grace raised a certain way, enrolled in certain schools, surrounded by certain, he calls it, the right foundation. He thinks Thomas is a good man, but not. She stopped. Not what? She didn't answer. She finished her coffee and left 20 minutes later. She hugged me at the door for a long time. I stood in my kitchen after she left and stood very still for a while. That evening I called Dale. Over the next several months I did things I had never imagined doing. I hired a private investigator. His name was Arthur Gaines, and Dale recommended him, and he was quiet and careful and thorough. I told Arthur I wanted to understand the financial structure of Victor's relationship with Thomas, specifically whether the month-to-month contract was being used in a way that created legal exposure. What Arthur found went considerably further than I had expected. The house Thomas and Serena lived in, a colonial in Mount Lebanon that I had assumed they'd purchased together, was owned entirely by a property holding company controlled by Victor Whitfield. Thomas's name was not on the deed. It had never been on the deed. Victor had presented it as a wedding gift but had never transferred ownership, and Thomas, who was not a lawyer and trusted his father-in-law, had never pushed the question. His salary was paid through a third-party LLC. The arrangement meant that Victor could terminate the relationship at any time without standard employment protections. And there was a provision in the prenuptial agreement which Thomas had signed with a lawyer Victor had recommended that made the marital assets, in the event of divorce, subject to conditions written in language that Thomas's attorney had characterized as standard, but which Dale, reading it 3 years later, characterized as extraordinarily favorable to one party. I read that prenuptial agreement on a Tuesday afternoon at my kitchen table. I read it twice. Then I sat back and thought about the word cozy. I need to tell you about what I learned concerning Grace, because this is the part that changed everything for me, not the finances, not the property, not the contracts. This is the part that kept me awake at night and sharpened everything I did afterward into something precise and cold and determined. Arthur, in the course of his investigation, spoke to a nurse who had briefly worked at the OB practice Serena had used during her pregnancy. This nurse was no longer employed there and had no particular loyalty to the Whitfields. She told Arthur that Serena had confided in her, during a difficult prenatal appointment, that she was not certain Thomas was Grace's father. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything with it. Then I asked Thomas to do something that I framed very carefully. I told him I was putting together a family health history document, something Carol and I had always meant to do and never had, and her cancer diagnosis made me think it was important. I said I wanted to include blood type information, basic genetic markers if he was willing, and that I thought it would be meaningful to have Grace's information in there too. I said I'd found an at-home kit we could use and make a little project of it. Thomas thought it was a lovely idea. He had no idea I was also submitting a sample from a cheek swab Grace had given me during one of her stays at my house. She stayed with me every other weekend and called it Grandpa Camp to a separate private lab. I got the results on a Wednesday. I closed the envelope. I put it in the drawer in my study, under the journal. Thomas was not Grace's biological father. I want to be clear about what I did not do next. I did not call Thomas immediately. I did not call Victor. I did not make any move that could be seen or anticipated. I sat with this knowledge, and I thought about what it meant, not just legally or logistically, but for a little girl who was almost 3 years old, and called me Grandpa Ray and liked strawberry jam on everything, and was afraid of the drain in the bathtub. I thought about what she needed, and I began building. I spent the next 8 months in deliberate, unhurried preparation. Dale helped me find Thomas a new attorney, someone in Pittsburgh, with no connections to the Whitfield family or their associated firms. I paid the retainer myself, from savings I had been quietly building since Carol died, money I had always intended to leave Thomas, and saw no reason to wait. We began the process of documenting everything: the property arrangement, the contract structure, the prenuptial agreement and its conflicts with Pennsylvania case law. Arthur continued his work and found 2 former Whitfield employees who had been let go under circumstances similar to what Thomas was likely facing. I called those former employees. I listened to them. I took notes. One of them, a man named Gary, who had managed 3 of Victor's properties for 9 years, said something I wrote down and kept. He doesn't fire people. He arranges circumstances until they have no choice but to walk away. Then he tells everyone you left voluntarily. And there's nothing in writing to say any different. I looked at the legal pad where I'd written that, and I thought about my son in his borrowed office, in his borrowed house, with his borrowed title, and I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as resolve. I did not tell Thomas any of this yet. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I knew my son. He would confront Victor immediately. He would demand explanations, give away the advantage, and Victor's lawyers would have a response ready within hours. I had watched Victor operate for years. He was not a man who was ever caught without a prepared position. I needed him caught without one. So I waited. The moment came on a Thursday in October. I was in my living room when Thomas called. His voice was flat in the way voices go when a person is holding themselves very carefully together. He locked us out, Dad. Serena and Grace are inside, but I went to the office this morning and my keycard didn't work. Victor called me at noon and said my engagement with the company was being terminated. When I drove home, my garage code didn't work. The locksmith was already there. He stopped. Grace is inside? Serena texted me. She says, Dad, I should take some time, that things have gotten complicated. She sounded like she was reading something. I closed my eyes for 2 seconds. Where are you right now? In the driveway. Is Grace with Serena? Is she safe? Yes, she's inside. She's fine. She doesn't know what's happening. Okay. You call the attorney. You call him right now and you tell him it's time. Then you come here. Silence. Dad, what attorney? I don't have a... His name is Michael Ferrara, and his number is on your phone under F. I added it 6 months ago. Call him, then come here. A longer silence. You knew. Come home, Thomas. He sat at my kitchen table for a long time after he arrived. I put coffee in front of him and let him be quiet for as long as he needed. Then I sat down across from him, and I started from the beginning. I told him everything. The journal, Arthur's findings, the property records, the LLC, the prenuptial agreement, and what it actually said. I set the folders on the table in front of him one at a time and let him read. When I got to the lab results, I paused. There's one more thing, I said, and I need you to hear it before you respond. He looked at me. I slid the envelope across the table. He read it slowly. Then he set it down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. She's not mine, he said. It wasn't a question. Biologically, I said. He looked at me. That is the only way in which she is not yours, I said. In every other way that has ever mattered, she is yours. She has always been yours. And that is not going to change because of what that piece of paper says. Not if I have anything to say about it. Thomas pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. We sat there for a while. Then he lowered his hands and looked at me with the expression of a man who has just understood something large and irreversible and is deciding in real time who he's going to be in response to it. What do we do? He said. We already started, I said. Michael Ferrara filed the first set of documents the following Monday morning. The core of the legal action was straightforward, even if the preparation behind it was not. The property holding company's failure to transfer the house constituted, under Pennsylvania law, a promissory arrangement that created enforceable rights. The LLC compensation structure, combined with the absence of a formal contract, gave Thomas grounds for an unpaid compensation claim, and the prenuptial agreement, reviewed now by a qualified independent attorney, had been prepared under conditions that raised questions about informed consent. Specifically the fact that the attorney Victor had recommended had a 17-year professional relationship with the Whitfield family that had never been disclosed to Thomas. Victor's attorneys responded within 48 hours. They were good. They were fast. They had clearly anticipated some version of this. They had not anticipated the scope of it. Arthur had spent 14 months being thorough. The former employees came forward. Gary's documentation of his own termination, which he had kept carefully in a fireproof box in his garage, mirrored Thomas's situation in ways that established a pattern. The second former employee, a property manager named Diane, had her own records. And then there was the matter of what Serena did. I will not speak harshly of Serena. She was put in an impossible position by a father who had never in her lifetime allowed her a decision that didn't ultimately serve his interests. What I will say is that when she understood the full extent of what had been done to Thomas, to her marriage, to her daughter's family, she made a choice that I think cost her more than it appeared to. She called Michael Ferrara's office. Voluntarily. She provided documentation that corroborated the property arrangement and the contract structure. She provided also voluntarily information about the circumstances of Grace's conception that she had been carrying alone for nearly 4 years. I don't know what it took for her to make that call. I know what it meant for our case. The settlement process took 4 months. I am not going to detail every piece of it because some of it is still bound by agreement and some of it doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. The house in Mount Lebanon was transferred to Thomas's name. The full legal process that Victor had assumed would protect his position was instead used correctly to enforce the original promise the house represented. The compensation claims were settled. Thomas's financial position was restored, and then some, including reimbursement for legal fees. The prenuptial agreement was set aside entirely. Victor Whitfield did not go to jail. I want to be honest about that. What he did was structured carefully enough to stay on the civil side of the law, and I'm not naive about what money can do in that regard. What I can tell you is that two of his largest commercial partners, made aware of the pattern of behavior documented in the proceedings, quietly ended their relationships with Whitfield Properties. A development project he had been planning for 3 years collapsed in the financing stage. The name does not open every door it once opened. I will take that. Grace turned 4 in January. We had her party at my house, because Thomas is living with me while he decides what comes next, and she decided she wanted a princess theme, which meant I spent a Saturday afternoon letting her put a paper crown on my head while I sat on the back porch in 30-degree weather and told her I was the king of the frozen kingdom. She thought this was the funniest thing that had ever happened. Thomas stood in the doorway watching us, and I could see him working through something. Not grief exactly, more like the slow work of accepting a new shape for things you thought you understood. He's doing that work honestly. That's all I can ask. The question of Grace's paternity is something Thomas and Serena will navigate together, for Grace's sake, because Grace is what matters. Thomas has not removed himself from her life for a single day. He picks her up, drops her off, reads to her at bedtime when it's his time, coaches her tiny soccer team on Saturday mornings. He has not faltered once. I did not expect anything different. He learned from somewhere. People sometimes ask me, my brother, Dale, a few men I've known for decades, whether I feel guilty for not telling Thomas sooner, for letting him walk through those months without knowing what was being prepared. I don't have a simple answer. What I know is that if I had told him when I first suspected something was wrong, he would have confronted Victor from emotion rather than from strength. Victor would have absorbed it, responded smoothly, and Thomas would have found himself isolated and without recourse. What I built required time and silence, and the discipline to hold a plan steady when every instinct said to act immediately. Was it right to let him not know? I don't know. I know it was necessary. I also know this. The most important thing I ever built was not a structure or a plan or a legal case. It was the knowledge that my son is going to be okay. That Grace is going to grow up with a man in her life who chose her, who keeps choosing her, and that the choosing matters more than the biology. Carol used to say that love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you decide, every morning, to keep doing. She was right about most things. I still think about her when I look at Grace, the shape of her eyes, the way she tilts her head when she's figuring something out. Some things you build with your hands. Some things you build with time. Some things you build with nothing but the decision to show up every day no matter what. That's the only kind of construction that never falls down.